Hello and welcome back to the Campus Ministry Show here at Lancaster Catholic. I'm Father Logue, chaplain of the high school and host of the show. We today are going to talk about something that doesn't get as much attention as maybe it should. Because a lot of people will look at, say, the Old Testament and say, oh, that's all fire and brimstone, hell and damnation and all that full and peaceful and not as scary. And that's not always the case. So I want to see what we can learn about the reality of hell from one particular insight in the New Testament that Jesus gives us. This is specifically the story of Lazarus and the rich man. So Jesus tells this parable, and the first thing we should note is we're not really clear that it is a parable or not. It might be an actual thing that happened that Jesus is telling us. Anyways, there's these two people, the rich man who lives in a big house and has tons of money and tons of parties and eats tons of food and is just generally not a great person. Then there's Lazarus, a poor man who lives on the street, homeless, sick, and he's laying at the foot of the rich man's house, like right where his path meets the street. That's where Lazarus lays. And the rich man, over the course of their lives, wouldn't give Lazarus any food at all. Totally disregarded him, totally didn't care about him and his situation and his plight. Now, Jesus says, eventually the rich man and Lazarus both die, and Lazarus he calls it the bosom of Abraham, goes to heaven, and the rich man goes to the fires of Gehenna, goes to hell. And there they are, the two of them, in the afterlife. Lazarus up with Abraham, the rich man down in hell. They're staring across this chasm, and the rich man calls up to Abraham, and he says, Father Abraham, it is kind of awful down here. Please send Lazarus with his finger dipped in water to give me a drop of water to cool this heat. And we should, if we're good, decent people, feel sympathetic for this rich man. Like, he's suffering there. This isn't good. We want to help him. And Abraham says, no, Lazarus will not help you. There's a chasm that cannot be crossed. Why is that? That sounds really mean. Well, first, we can learn a little bit about the rich man's attitude by what he's saying. Notice he's not saying, hey, can I come up there for 5 minutes and cool off a little bit? He doesn't want to go up there. An important thing to remember about hell is the gates of hell are locked from the inside. People aren't in hell because they aren't allowed into heaven. They're in hell because they don't want to be in heaven. They don't want a relationship with God, and they would find heaven oppressive and awful. So God, in his mercy, doesn't subject them to something that they would find awful, but the alternative is really not much better for them. The other thing we can learn about the rich man's attitude is what he asks. He doesn't ask just for a drop of water. He doesn't ask to be able to go and get a drop of water. He wants Lazarus to serve him. This is something that he was unwilling to do for Lazarus his entire life. He was unwilling to send a servant to serve Lazarus. And so his attitude really hasn't changed. He's still the same stuck-up, awful, self-absorbed rich man that he was before. Now he's just not enjoying himself as he once did. So those are some good insights we can learn from this parable, that the people in hell are there because they don't want to be in heaven, and they're there because their attitude hasn't changed. They're not filled with regret. Now, the rich man does want his brothers to avoid this fate, and so he asks Abraham to send Lazarus, again wanting him to do the work, to warn his brothers, and Abraham says, no, I'm not even going to do that, because they didn't listen to Moses and the prophets and the law. And if they didn't listen to that, Abraham says, neither will they be convinced if someone were to rise from the dead. Now that should stand out to us, because while Abraham is probably right in that if they're not listening to the law and the prophets and all of these things that have been presented to them, they're probably not even going to be convinced by some big miracle. But we know that Jesus did that anyway. So that should be our reason for hope in all of this, that even though, as Abraham himself says in the parable, someone rising from the dead has a slim chance of convincing someone that their ways are wrong and to reform and repent, God does that anyways. And he wants to do the same thing for all of us in our sin. He wants to reach out and try and help us out of it, even in ways that he knows are not likely to succeed. And so all we have to do is look for one of those many opportunities that he gives us to grab the helping hand, to pull us out of the mire that we're stuck in, and then we'll be with Abraham and Lazarus, and not stuck on the outside, not wanting to get in. So hopefully that gives us some insight to be cautious, to be attentive, not to be frightened, but to be well aware of the reality of what we face in eternity and the decision that we face by how we live our lives now. Are we going to live our lives in such a way that we will want to be in heaven with God? Or are we going to live our lives in such a way that we won't want that? Hopefully this helps shed some light on this important topic. Thanks for joining, and God bless.